Hello, hi, nice to see you all. My name is Atte Borgenström, and I came here to tell you a little bit about carbon footprint in supply chain. I think I have to put this timer on first, I don't know how. If I just press it, nothing happens. Yes, now. But basically, it's really exciting to be here. Last 2 years I've been presenting basically only online and mostly in Finnish. But I checked, I have my pants on, so I'm good. And it's really nice to see people. Thank you, Salla, for your presentation. It was really interesting. And if I recall, Neste is ranked in the Corporate Knights most sustainable companies in the world in the top 20. So basically, you had a best benchmark for sustainability, what there can be in the world. So that's pretty good. And I'm going to take you a little bit more in the grassroots level and talk about a little bit more why and how carbon footprint is controlled and why it's so topical at the moment, also for the smaller companies. And yes, please feel free to ask if there's something to ask. Yes. Shortly about the Reforest first. We are a company from here, Tampere region, a comprehensive partner to organizations sustainability, meaning that we do ESG reporting, sustainability reporting, carbon footprint calculation and all the other stuff with the carbon footprint. And then compensation project we offer different kinds of, and then sustainability communication. And we have been doing or piloting a local carbon sinks with Finnish cities, basically like a local offsetting projects. And then we are a partner of Hinku, which is like a carbon neutral cities network here in Finland. But at the moment, most of our time goes with carbon footprint calculations. That's really topical at the moment. And then we offer different kinds of offset projects all over the world, basically. Larry Fink, American billionaire and CEO and founder of BlackRock, which is the world's largest investment company, wrote this year that we focus on sustainability not because we are environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and responsible to our clients. And he continued, every company and every industry will be transformed by the transition to a net zero world. The question is, will you lead or will you be led? And it describes really well this whole agenda. Basically, this transition is coming whether the companies want it or not. And it's really about that, will you be the first ones or the last one who will have to do it by the law, for example. Before we dive into carbon footprint, it's good to think about the whole sustainability, and there is some overlap with Salla's presentation, but hopefully you don't mind. Sustainability in general refers to doing business without negatively impacting environment, community, or a society as a whole, and generally addresses to two main categories, which are the effect business has on environment and the effect business has on society. And sustainability is not a new thing. Basically, companies have been talking about corporate social responsibility and corporate citizenship and corporate governance and so on, but now lately everybody is talking about ESG, which means environmental, social and governance aspects, what companies face in their daily business. And why companies do this sustainability, I sincerely believe, and like Salla stated, companies really want to do good. They want to solve social and environmental problems, and they want to minimize the harm that they are causing to, for example, environment. But it is clear that companies also want to do well, basically making profit. And these two things do not exclude each other, vice versa. Basically, there is synergies in that. And if you think about this doing well point of view, like Salla stated about the investors, that's one good example, but then also, for example, the legislation and laws are changing constantly, so basically it's also like preparing for the future. And by the end of the day, eventually people prefer to buy from sustainable sellers. Basically, people prefer to or are willing to pay more for sustainably produced goods or services. Yes, and basically Salla showed you this sustainable development goals already, so they're divided into 17 sections, the whole sustainability, and basically all of these are divided into small subsections, and we are today, there's a red arrow, so you are here, basically, that's showing that. So we are in the number 13, climate actions, and only part of climate actions, which are emissions. And why we are focusing on so small niche is that it's the, I would say it's the most topical at the moment. FIPS, which is the largest corporate responsibility network in the Nordics, made a survey for 1,000 biggest companies. And according to survey, organizations' focus points in 2002 are strongly in sustainability, are strongly in climate and emissions. Most of the executives, I think it was over 80%, told that climate change will be important or very important in the next 12 months. So basically, I would dare to say that emissions at the moment are the most topical issue in sustainability. But what will happen in the next 3-4 years, nobody knows. It can be the biodiversity or something else. But that's the situation at the moment. Yes. Then emissions. What and why? So basically, it all starts from the climate change. I'm pretty sure that nobody of you has been able to avoid hearing about climate change. So I thought that I'm going to skip lecturing about climate change here. But basically, carbon dioxide or CO2 are the primary driver for global climate change, and it's widely recognized that the worst impacts of the climate change happen because of the emissions. And the world needs urgently to reduce the emissions. Maybe the most known target of limiting the global warming is the Paris Agreement, where the target is to reduce the global warming into 1.5 Celsius. And like Salla mentioned, this science-based targets, that is, for example, a base there. And then if we look at the Finland, for example, Finland has the same carbon neutrality target than Neste had, right? 2035. And for my opinion is, well, 2035, it's a little bit more than 10 years from now. And it means that Finland as a country wouldn't basically emit anything, or theoretically, of course there's offsets and anything, but theoretically Finland wouldn't emit anything in a bit more than 10 years. So it's pretty obvious that it is a crazy target. And it's clear to say that the legislation and regulations are constantly and really, really fast changing towards the carbon neutrality, and that will affect to all companies. And now the latest factor which describes pretty well the sustainability and the topicality of the sustainability at the moment is EU taxonomy, which means in practice that bigger than 250 people companies need to start reporting their sustainability. I think it was next year or year after that, as mandatory as economic figures. And 2 years back, nobody was even heard about EU taxonomy, so it came really, really fast. And now, all of a sudden, it's something that changes the way of reporting of the companies. And basically because all of this are causing these other reasons, people and their opinions have dramatically changed in the last couple of years. People are more concerned and sustainability is affecting to their behavior and consumption habits. And yes, and before we go deep into the emissions, I would like to ask how many of you or your companies have actually calculated their carbon footprint? Good. No, not so many. That's good for me. So, I mean, not as business-wise. I was thinking that this is not totally old stuff for you. Great. That's great. I was actually a little bit scared that if everybody raises hands, that's a bad thing. So basically, to be able to answer how these emissions and targets are affecting the supply chain, which was the topic, we need to have a closer look at the company's emission sources. And this picture is from a greenhouse gas protocol, which is like a standard for the calculating emissions. And it categorizes the company's emission sources into three different sections or scopes, as they are called here. In the middle, there's scope number 1, which is organization's direct emissions. For example, from vehicles company owns, or if a company is producing own energy or something else, like direct emissions what company causes. Then on the left-hand side, there's scope number 2, purchased electricity, and something's happening with the voice. You're hearing me well? Okay, good. Purchased electricity and heat, so basically all the purchased energy. And these scopes number 1 and 2 are basically the company's own emissions, which are like mandatory to calculate. They're also basically pretty easy to calculate, and it's pretty easy to even reduce nowadays, especially for example in Finland. It's really easy to change to renewable energy and so on. A couple of years back, even the biggest companies were calculating their own emissions, the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And they were concentrating on that and leaving all the value chain and the supply chain out of their scope. But basically, on average, supply chain is around 12 times higher. The emissions of supply chain is around 12 times higher than the own emissions or scope 1 and 2 emissions. So basically, if you are looking at the big picture, it's a really small part if you are calculating only your own 1 and 2 emissions. So last couple of years, companies, starting from the big companies, have started to dig deeper into their scope 3 emissions. The scope 3 emissions you can see there, so basically starting from the purchased raw materials, capital goods, waste, logistics, business traveling, etc., and all the way, same thing, downstream activities into all the way to the customer or the end user. So all of a sudden, we are in a situation that companies ask for life cycle analysis or carbon footprint from cradle to grave from their supply chain. And that has changed, and we have seen a big change in that, let's say, in the last 2 years in there, that even the small and medium-sized companies are asking for carbon footprint calculations and are starting to think of these things because their bigger customer is asking the information from them. And basically, the only way to be able to reduce the emissions is to know them, and it starts from the supply chain. The biggest effect is there. So, how to control carbon footprint? There's actually Heikki in that picture from Haarla. When starting the journey, it always starts from the definition base. The definition means calculating company's emissions. By defining the organization's carbon footprint, the company gets the understanding what's the current situation. And then, as a result, definition base, companies need to think about the reduction methods and targets, and like Salla stated, carbon roadmaps. I will tell you shortly a little bit more precise about this. And then when moving towards the carbon neutrality, meaning that the carbon emissions of a company would be a zero, then compensation comes into a question at some point. And all the way on the process, calculating, reducing and compensating communication plays a crucial role, and it is really important to remember to communicate, especially for the supply chain as well. But yes, so let's look at those a little bit more precise and start from the define. Like mentioned, defining means the calculating company's emissions. So we gather kilowatts, we gather liters of gasoline, we gather purchased raw materials and so on from organization and turn them with different emission factors into CO2 form. That's basically how simple it is. And as a result, we get the amount in kilos or in CO2 tons of the company's emissions, which illustrates the carbon footprint. Carbon footprint calculation is still evolving, and I could say it's a new thing somehow. Greenhouse gas protocol, which I mentioned, is most widely used standard for calculating the emissions, and it gives a specific guidance how and what emissions needs to be calculated and how to report them. And it really helps to harmonize the calculation and reporting all over the world, but still there is differences in calculation methods and approaches, and further you go from your own emissions till the supply chain, the information can vary, and it may be or it is really important to ensure the reliable information, let's say that. So basically world is not ready with the calculation yet. Also, availability and delimitation of information plays a crucial role in this calculation, and identifying the relevant sources and making sure that the information is reliable, like said, and emission factors and so on correct is really, really important. But then, when the calculation have been done, we get the figure from the company, carbon footprint. The next logical step is to start thinking about the reduction. That's basically the basis of the calculation. You get the idea where you are today so that you can start improving. And by improving I mean reducing the emissions. And many times in this place, companies do carbon roadmaps, like Salla stated and showed actually Neste's roadmap. But basically the roadmap means that you put the figure, what you got from the calculation on the other side of the timeline, and you put the target where you want to go on the other side of the timeline. And then you start thinking about the reduction methods and the timeline, when and how you're going to do those things. Many companies have carbon neutrality targets at the moment. It is really topical and trendy, maybe also even there is tough targets like 2025, but I think most of the companies have this same target as Finland, 2035, with a bit more than 10 years to be carbon neutral at that time. And normally emissions are calculated once a year. Typically it's a calendar year, but it can be an accounting period or something else as well. And it's quite a long time frame for one calculation. So basically monitoring, it's basically important to ensure that they're collecting the information so that it can be compared next year and it's measurable and comparable with the older calculations. Yes, as it, like mentioned, many companies' target is carbon neutrality, meaning that the emissions are zero. And it is really rare for most of the companies to achieve carbon neutrality at the moment, at least. Hopefully the thing is different in 20 years, but at the moment at least without compensation or offsetting. So compensation means that companies can finance a project that binds or reduces the emissions somewhere else. And then they can calculate those reductions out of their own carbon footprint. And as the word compensation stands, it is a good way to compensate the climate disadvantage what the company is doing, but it is a passive action. So basically it doesn't have any effect whether or not the company is polluting in the future or not. So that's why it should always start from calculating, reducing and then compensating. That is the most logical and the best way to do or to reduce emissions. There is many different kinds of projects in the compensation, most of them at the moment happening in developing countries, and there's lots of discussion about this compensation at the moment ongoing. And voluntary compensation, or this compensation, is different than emissions trading. That's good to bear in mind that it has nothing to do with the emission trading. And then my own opinion is that many companies do and think of emissions and other sustainability issues quite a lot, but you don't use them so much in a business communication as they should. This has changed in last 2 years quite a lot, and nowadays when you go to the grocery store, at least in Finland, you see every other product has a carbon neutrality or something else green on their packages. But there is constantly growing interest towards these matters, also in a business-to-business side, but also consumer side, and these things should be utilized in a business communication, and the good deeds should be showed for everybody. And the sustainability communication, it is different depending on the stakeholder. Basically, you are doing these things for yourself, but there is always somebody else, some stakeholder who you are aiming to impress. So when starting the whole journey, it's good to think of how and what should the communication of sustainability look, and who is the stakeholder you are aiming. I showed you this picture from the greenhouse gas emissions earlier, and so when we come to the title of my presentation, Carbon Footprint in Supply Chain, this picture explains it pretty well, and hopefully I'm able to explain it to you as well. As mentioned, the changing trend at the moment, and the explaining thing why this carbon footprint is so topical in the supply chains at the moment, is that the bigger companies have started to dig deeper into their scope 3 emissions, which means basically the supply chain as well. Couple years back, roughly 2 years back, I was trying to sell our services to this one subcontractor in Finland, and I called him. He was a CEO of this subcontractor for a big Finnish company, and I was trying to sell our services, and he told me on the phone that this viherpiiperys doesn't interest us. And viherpiiperys, I don't know if there's a translation for that, but it's basically not so polite way to say that this is not their cup of tea. Sorry? Tree hugging. Tree. Yes, tree. Yes, tree hugging. That's a good translation. And the same CEO called me 2 years later that they are now in a tender request process for this big company, and there is actually mandatory field to know carbon footprint, and he remembered our call, and he told me that now this viherpiiperys starts to interest me. So basically I think that's really a good example of how these things evolve. And just a couple of examples. I think they're quite small, but I can read you through the same idea. These are all Finnish companies, big companies, but basically Metso Autotech sustainability report last year saying that they're aiming to reduce 20% of logistics and 30% of the supplier spend. Same thing, Kone saying we also target a 40% reduction in scope 3, meaning the supply chain emissions, and then Nokia scope 3 emissions from our supply chain were approximately 1.6 million metric tons, meaning basically that when they start reducing, they started from the supply chain. Then, short recap. Basically, when starting to control your company's carbon footprint, start it by measuring or defining your company's emissions. After that, plan a realistic reduction map. I always say that I think that the carbon neutrality shouldn't be the first target. The realistic reduction is a much better target, something that is possible to achieve. After that, concentrate on the matters you can affect, basically first meaning those scope 1 and 2, and something from scope 3, and after that improvement together with your supply chain, and that is where you can do the big change, like Salla stated. Then, like mentioned, communicate openly. It is really important, and it needs to be done quite carefully to avoid the greenwashing. There is a couple of examples how even the really good deeds have turned actually against the company because of bad communication. And like Larry Fink stated, it's better to be the one who's leading than the one who will be led. So do it before it's mandatory. Thank you very much. That was my presentation.